In the winter of 1943, a single sheet of paper crossed the desk of a weary German general in Berlin. It was an intercepted intelligence report, crude in presentation, but devastating in implication. Allied factories, the report claimed, were producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery at rates that seemed impossible. The numbers were dismissed at first, chalked up to propaganda or deliberate exaggeration. After all, how could the so-called decadent democracies of America and Britain possibly sustain such output? Germany, with its strict regimentation and central control, prided itself on efficiency. The Allies, in the eyes of Nazi leadership, were fragmented, soft, incapable of true industrial focus. But the paper told another story. Tanks rolling off assembly lines in thousands, aircraft factories roaring day and night, shipyards launching Liberty ships at a pace of one every few days. Even the most cautious German analysts were shocked. In certain sectors, the Allies had surpassed the Reich's grim projections, not by a small margin, but by hundreds of percent. 3 times more planes, 3 times more armored vehicles, 3 times more trucks to feed an army on the move. What Germany considered impossible had become reality. The numbers, when seen in cold clarity, were staggering. Between 1940 and 1945, American factories alone produced over 88,000 tanks, more than 300,000 aircraft, and well over 2 million trucks. Britain, though battered by the Blitz and strained by years of war, contributed thousands of heavy bombers, tanks, and armored cars. Canada, often overlooked in German intelligence, added another surge of vehicles and weapons to the Allied stockpile. Together, this coalition of factories and foundries formed a machine so vast that it dwarfed anything the Axis could field. Yet inside the German High Command, denial reigned. The generals were told what they wanted to hear, that the Allies could not sustain such output, that resources would collapse, that America lacked the will to endure the sacrifices of total war. But at the front, German soldiers saw the truth with their own eyes. In North Africa, the desert filled with seemingly endless convoys of Allied trucks. In Italy, waves of Sherman tanks kept arriving, even after entire battalions had been destroyed in battle. And in the skies over Germany itself, thousands of bombers formed dark clouds that blotted out the sun, escorted by swarms of fighters that seemed never to run short. For the average German soldier, the effect was psychological as much as tactical. How do you fight an enemy who never seems to run out of steel, fuel, or ammunition? For every tank knocked out, 2 more seemed to appear. For every bomber shot down, 10 more replaced it. The battlefield began to feel like a conveyor belt, an endless stream of Allied power that no amount of bravery, no tactical genius could fully halt. By late 1943, the realization could no longer be ignored. The Allies were not just keeping pace with German production, they had left the Reich behind. Hitler's boast that Nazi Germany would overwhelm the industrial weaklings of the West had been shattered by the roar of Allied assembly lines. Germany had underestimated not just the factories, but the will of entire nations to harness every ounce of manpower and material into the war effort. But beneath the thunder of machines and the rivers of steel lay a deeper mystery. Production on this scale was not an accident of geography or luck. Something had shifted in the Allied war machine, something hidden, coordinated, and far more powerful than even the raw numbers suggested. The German general reading that report in 1943 could not see it yet. But history would reveal it in time, because the question was no longer whether the Allies could outproduce the Axis. The question was far more unsettling. What hidden force had turned the Allies into an unstoppable juggernaut? In the summer of 1940, Europe lay in shock. The German blitzkrieg, once dismissed as reckless bravado, had swept across Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and finally France in a matter of months. The world had witnessed modern warfare reborn, columns of panzers slicing through defenses, squadrons of Stukas screaming overhead, armies collapsing in days instead of years. For many, it seemed as if the Wehrmacht was unstoppable. Behind this illusion of invincibility stood hard numbers, numbers that gave Hitler and his generals confidence that Germany had secured a decisive lead. By the height of the Blitzkrieg, the Reich commanded roughly 4,500 tanks and more than 4,000 aircraft, weapons that had shattered armies still clinging to the strategies of the last war. The Allies, by comparison, looked like relics of a different century. Britain's factories were still recovering from the economic wounds of the Depression. Production lines ran on outdated methods, straining to replace the colossal losses of Dunkirk, where more than 60,000 vehicles and thousands of guns had been abandoned on the beaches. Across the Atlantic, America, sleeping giant though it was, remained mired in isolationism. In 1940, U.S. factories produced just 12,800 aircraft, a number that sounded impressive until measured against the scale of global war. Most of these planes were obsolete biplanes or underpowered trainers, unsuitable for the fierce battles raging over Europe, and in the East, the Soviet Union staggered under the aftershocks of Stalin's purges. Thousands of officers, engineers, and factory directors had been executed or imprisoned in the years before the war, leaving the Red Army disorganized and its industry chaotic. Soviet tank plants produced machines in large numbers, but quality was inconsistent and leadership was in disarray. In Berlin, the picture was clear. Germany stood ahead in every measurable category. Its military machine was modern, tested, and battle-hardened. Its enemies were fractured, hesitant, and underprepared. The illusion was intoxicating. Nazi propaganda painted Germany as the engine of a new order in Europe, a master of both tactics and technology. Hitler himself reveled in the numbers, convinced that no coalition of democracies and dictatorships could match the Reich's focused might. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Britain, though battered, had not surrendered. Its factories, guided by men like Lord Beaverbrook, were being restructured at breakneck speed, cranking out Hurricanes and Spitfires in quantities the Luftwaffe had not expected. Across the Atlantic, in Detroit and Pittsburgh, industrialists like William Knudsen and Henry Kaiser were quietly retooling America's production lines. Automobile plants that once produced sedans were being redesigned to stamp out tanks and aircraft. Even in the Soviet Union, despite chaos and repression, engineers like Mikhail Koshkin had already gifted the Red Army with the T-34, a tank that would soon reveal itself as one of the most effective designs of the entire war. Still, in 1940, these developments were only whispers against the roar of the German juggernaut. The Wehrmacht marched on, its confidence swelling with every victory. Its enemies mocked as weaklings, clinging to outdated weapons and broken economies. For the average German soldier, it was easy to believe the illusion. They had seen the Blitzkrieg succeed again and again. They had watched entire armies collapse in their wake. Even Allied leaders, staring at grim production charts, wondered whether their nations could ever catch up. And yet, in the shadows, something had begun to stir. Factories were being retooled, alliances strengthened, and the seeds of an industrial revolution were being sown. The illusion of German supremacy would not last forever, for while Hitler boasted of his invincible Reich, a seismic shift was already rumbling beneath the surface. The question was simple and terrifying. Could it challenge Hitler's confidence? The year was 1941. And the world stood at a precipice. What had begun as a European conflict was about to engulf the globe. On June 22nd, Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, his gamble to destroy the Soviet Union in a single blow. 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, and nearly 3,000 tanks surged across the eastern frontier. The scale of the invasion was unprecedented, the ambition breathtaking. German planners believed the Red Army would crumble within weeks. Stalin's empire, still staggering from purges and political terror, seemed ripe for collapse. 6 months later, on December 7th, the illusion of distance vanished for America. Japanese aircraft swept down on Pearl Harbor, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet and dragging the reluctant giant into total war. Overnight, the arsenal of democracy was no longer a slogan, but a necessity. America could no longer remain apart. It had been struck, bloodied, and forced into the fight. Suddenly, the three great Allied powers, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, were locked in a desperate race for survival. For Britain, survival was personal. Cities smoldered under the Blitz, factories rattled by bombs, yet the machines did not stop. Amid the rubble of Coventry, Birmingham, and London, workers labored through the night. In one such plant, a woman named Margaret Hughes, one of hundreds of thousands of women pressed into industrial service, remembered hammering rivets into aircraft fuselages as glass from shattered windows crunched underfoot. The air was cold, the floor wet, and the sound of sirens constant. Yet production never ceased. Each bomber that left the factory was another chance to strike back at the Reich. In the Soviet Union, the cost was even greater. Whole factories were dismantled and shipped eastward, away from the advancing Wehrmacht. Machine tools, blueprints, and workers traveled thousands of miles to the Urals and Siberia, rebuilt in makeshift halls under brutal conditions. Despite the chaos, the Red Army received more than 5,000 tanks in 1941 alone, a miracle of resilience considering the hammer blows it endured. The T-34, rushed into mass production, proved a revelation. Against German Panzer IIIs and IVs, its sloped armor and powerful gun gave the Soviets a fighting chance, but German confidence remained unshaken. Within Hitler's war councils, the forecasts were simple. Britain would eventually be starved by U-boats. America would flounder under the weight of rearmament, and the Soviet Union would collapse before the snows of winter. Nazi analysts calculated production curves, manpower reserves, and shipping losses, and concluded the Allies could never hope to match the Reich's momentum. In their eyes, the war was already tilting toward inevitable German victory. Yet outside the maps and charts of Berlin, the war told another story. The Allies were bleeding, yes, but they were not breaking. The British worker hammering rivets in a bombed-out plant. The Soviet engineer assembling tanks in a frozen shed. The American machinist turning automobile lines into military production. All were part of a vast, invisible army. An army not of soldiers, but of steel and sweat, of sacrifice and endurance. The wake of war had changed everything. The conflict was no longer a contest of tactics alone, but a titanic struggle of economies and wills. The Allies stood battered and unprepared, yet alive. And as their enemies calculated their doom, they prepared for something greater, a war not measured in weeks or months, but in years. The question lingered, heavy and uncertain. Could the Allies defy these grim forecasts, or were they outmatched? The storm of 1941 had left the Allies staggering. Britain was still standing, but only barely. The Soviet Union bled daily as German armies drove deep into its heartlands. America, fresh from the shock of Pearl Harbor, faced the colossal task of building a war machine almost from scratch. But within this desperation lay the spark of transformation. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt declared the United States would become the arsenal of democracy. It was not just rhetoric, it was a mandate. The nation that once prided itself on consumer goods now pointed every tool, every assembly line toward war. Automobile factories that had churned out Buicks and Chevrolets were stripped down and rebuilt to stamp out Sherman tanks and fighter aircraft. Civilian production was slashed, rationing introduced, and the full weight of American industry redirected toward the front lines. No symbol captured this shift more than Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan. Designed with the precision of an automobile factory, but built for aviation, Willow Run became the largest assembly line of its kind. By 1944, its workers could produce a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. An aircraft every hour. The scale was staggering, something no German planner had believed possible in 1940. Across the Atlantic, another miracle was unfolding under harsher conditions. In the Soviet Union, factories were torn from the soil and shipped east, away from the German advance. Entire cities seemed to move overnight. Trains carried steel presses, lathes, and even half-finished tanks thousands of miles into the wilderness. Workers, often women and teenagers, reassembled production halls under freezing skies. They slept beside the machines, fueled by little more than bread and determination. Out of this chaos, an industrial machine rose in the Urals and Siberia, churning out T-34s and Katyusha rocket launchers in numbers that stunned even Soviet commanders. Together, these shifts began to reshape the balance of power. Germany, meanwhile, stood confident in its own forecasts. In 1941, Nazi economists had predicted Allied collapse within 2 years. They assumed Britain would exhaust its reserves, the Soviet Union would fall under the weight of invasion, and America, clumsy and untested, would never convert its vast civilian economy in time. Hitler mocked Roosevelt's words as hollow promises, but the numbers told another story. By 1942, American aircraft production had doubled. Tank output surged from a few hundred per month to thousands. In the Soviet Union, even as Leningrad starved and Stalingrad burned, tank factories in the east delivered wave after wave of armored brigades. Britain, battered but unyielding, increased its production of heavy bombers, preparing to strike Germany's industrial heart. This was no longer a war of illusion, it was a war of numbers. The Axis powers still held the initiative on the battlefield, but for the first time, the tide of industrial might began to flow against them. Every destroyed tank could be replaced, every sunken ship rebuilt, every aircraft shot down, answered by 2 more in the sky. For German soldiers at the front, the sense of endless reserves pressing against them became a grim reality. And yet, questions lingered. Could the Allies sustain this momentum? Could their factories, their workers, their fragile supply lines withstand the relentless pressure of Axis offensives still rolling across continents? Or would the surge prove only a temporary reprieve, another illusion to be shattered in the fire of war? The answer lay in the battles yet to come. But for now, one thing was clear: the arsenal of democracy was no myth. It was real, and it had begun to roar. But could this momentum hold against relentless Axis pressure? Behind the roar of furnaces and the endless clatter of machines, the true face of the war effort was not generals or politicians, but ordinary men and women. The arsenal of democracy was not built by steel alone. It was built by hands, by sweat, and by sacrifice. In America, the entry into war triggered a social revolution. With millions of men drafted into the armed forces, factories turned to an untapped resource: women. By 1944, more than 19 million American women had entered the workforce, filling roles once thought impossible. They riveted bomber wings, welded tank hulls, and calibrated the delicate instruments of warplanes. Rosie the Riveter became more than a poster. It was a symbol of determination. Many women worked double shifts, balancing factory floors by day and households by night. For them, victory was not just a distant slogan. It was the reason their husbands, sons and brothers might come home alive. Across the ocean, the Soviet story was harsher, but no less heroic. In the frozen depths of the Urals, teenagers barely old enough to shave worked beside their mothers and sisters, producing the T-34 tanks that would fight at Stalingrad and Kursk. Conditions were brutal. Machinery often froze in the winter, food was scarce, and sleep was a luxury. One Soviet worker later recalled, "We built tanks as the shells fell around us." If one factory was bombed, another rose overnight. The urgency was absolute. Every tank completed could mean survival. Every delay could mean death. In Britain, the workforce reflected the scars of years already spent at war. Many workers were veterans of the First World War, men with stiff joints and fading eyesight who returned to the factories to do their part again. Alongside them stood evacuees from bombed-out cities, children too young to fight but old enough to carry parts, sweep the floors, or fetch tools for the machinists. They labored through blackouts, their factories covered in camouflage netting to avoid the Luftwaffe's eye. When bombs did fall, production rarely stopped for long. A crater might gape outside the assembly hall. But the lines kept moving, machines repaired, workers back at their stations before the smoke had cleared. Yet even with this collective resolve, challenges gnawed at the effort. Raw material shortages forced constant improvisation. In America, copper was rationed, aluminum prioritized, rubber recycled from old tires and boots. In the Soviet Union, shortages were crippling. Factories had to repurpose steel meant for tractors or farm tools into tank armor. In Britain, bombings destroyed warehouses of supplies overnight. Workers sometimes produced weapons faster than ammunition could be shipped, straining logistics to the breaking point. Still, the factories never slept. The workers understood something fundamental, that the front line stretched far beyond the trenches and the tanks. Their labor was a weapon. Each rivet struck into place was a bullet fired. Each completed bomber was another shadow in the sky above Germany. Each tank rolling off the line was a defiant answer to Hitler's boasts. By 1943, the combined output of Allied factories dwarfed even the most generous German estimates. The Reich had believed the democracies too weak, the Soviets too broken, the Americans too slow. Instead, the workers of 3 continents proved them wrong. The war was no longer fought only by soldiers. It was fought by machinists, welders, engineers, and children carrying parts under the dim glow of factory lamps. The question now was not whether the Allies could produce, but what this production would mean on the battlefield. And as the machines of war poured forth in numbers never before seen, the calendar moved toward a year that would change everything, because as factories roared, one year would shatter all German calculations. What was it? The year 1943 was a pivot in the story of the Second World War. 2 years earlier, the Allies had been reeling, their factories scrambling to adapt, their armies struggling to survive. Now the tide of industry was cresting into a wave that threatened to drown the Axis powers. In the United States, aircraft plants stretched from California to Michigan, their assembly lines roaring 24 hours a day. That year alone, America produced more than 96,000 aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports, and trainers. It was a number so vast that it dwarfed anything the Axis could imagine. Rows of gleaming P-51 Mustangs and B-17 Flying Fortresses rolled out like clockwork, their engines tested, their wings shining beneath the factory lights before being shipped overseas. In the Soviet Union, the miracle continued. Despite the devastation of war, more than 24,000 tanks thundered off Soviet production lines in 1943. The T-34, now refined with stronger armor and better guns, appeared in endless brigades. At Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, Soviet crews drove machines straight from the factory floor into combat. The factories, battered but unbroken, were feeding the Red Army at a pace Germany could no longer match. Britain, though smaller in scale, delivered its own hammer blows. More than 7,000 heavy bombers were produced in a single year, enough to darken German skies in relentless night raids. For the Luftwaffe, once dominant, the skies were becoming a graveyard. Outnumbered, outbuilt, and outlasted, German pilots faced swarms of Allied aircraft that seemed inexhaustible. Even within German intelligence, doubts turned into shock. One surviving memo from a Wehrmacht officer reveals the disbelief. Allied output, he admitted, had surpassed projections by as much as 300%. Numbers once dismissed as propaganda were now fact. The officer's words carried a grim weight. We miscalculated their capacity. They produce as if from another world. And for German soldiers at the front, it did feel like another world. A panzer crew might destroy a line of Shermans one day, only to face twice as many the next. Luftwaffe pilots could shoot down bombers over Hamburg and return the next week to see the skies just as full. In Italy, convoys of Allied trucks stretched beyond the horizon, carrying fuel, ammunition, and food in quantities the starving Wehrmacht could only dream of. For the Allied workers who powered this transformation, the moment was deeply personal. In Detroit, one factory foreman paused as he watched another B-24 bomber roll off the line. He later recalled, "We didn't see machines. We saw sons. We saw brothers." Every plane was a promise that someone had a fighting chance to come home. In the Soviet Union, a teenage welder remembered how she and her friends counted each tank with pride. As if every one of them carried their own signatures into battle, the tipping point had arrived. No longer was Allied production merely catching up, it was overwhelming. The arsenal of democracy and the furnace of Soviet industry were no longer defensive shields. They had become offensive weapons. For the first time since 1939, the Axis powers faced not just resistance, but an inexhaustible tide of steel, fire, and determination. But the question remained. These numbers, these thousands of planes, tanks, and bombers, were still only potential. The true test would not be on factory floors or production charts. It would be on the battlefield, in the mud, the skies, and the ruined cities where the war's outcome would be decided. The world now waited to see how would this arsenal reshape the battlefield. By 1943, the factories of Detroit, Coventry, and the Ural Mountains had become as decisive as any battlefield. The weapons they poured out in staggering numbers were no longer just statistics. They were steel legions reshaping the war's front lines. What had once been Germany's confidence in technological superiority was now eroding under the relentless weight of Allied mass production. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet T-34 tank became a symbol of resilience. Sleek yet rugged, it could be built quickly, repaired in the field, and driven by barely trained crews. By late 1943, Red Army offensives rolled forward with waves of these machines, so numerous that German soldiers began calling them the Locusts. At Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, Soviet industry made its mark. Despite staggering losses, the Soviets had enough replacements to continue pushing forward. One German colonel admitted in a private letter, "We destroy 100 and 100 more appear." It is as if their factories are on our very doorstep. In the skies over Europe, America's industrial might revealed itself with devastating clarity. Squadrons of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators filled the horizon, their formations blotting out the sun. In 1943 alone, the US produced nearly 96,000 aircraft, more than Germany had built in the previous 4 years combined. Strategic bombing campaigns over Hamburg, Schweinfurt, and the Ruhr Valley battered German industry, stretching the Luftwaffe to its breaking point. That year, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,000 planes, a hemorrhage of men and machines it could not recover from. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, American Sherman tanks began arriving in vast numbers. While individually outgunned by German Tigers and Panthers, the Sherman's reliability and sheer availability made the difference. One U.S. general quipped, "We may not have the best tank, but we'll always have 5 of them for every German one." The math was undeniable. Factories had become as lethal as artillery. The psychological toll on German officers was growing. In captured diaries, frustration was evident. One officer, taken prisoner in Italy, sneered bitterly, "They fight with machines, not men. Their factories are the real army." What had started as scorn for inferior Allied equipment had turned into despair at its endless supply. For every Panther painstakingly assembled in a bomb-threatened German plant, 10 Shermans rolled off American assembly lines, or 10 T-34s thundered out of Soviet workshops in the Urals. In Britain, production also surged, albeit on a smaller scale. By 1943, British factories produced over 7,000 heavy bombers, enabling nightly raids over German cities. Veteran British workers, many of them too old or too injured to fight, found themselves contributing to the war in another way, by turning wrenches, riveting fuselages, and welding ship hulls. "We felt every plane was a soldier we had made," recalled one woman who had worked in a Manchester aircraft plant during the Blitz. When they flew off, it was like watching your son go to war. This flood of equipment shifted the balance of the war irreversibly. Stalingrad had already proven that Germany could be beaten. By 1943, Kursk and the relentless Allied bombing campaigns made it clear Germany was not just being beaten, it was being overwhelmed. The very weapons once meant to ensure Nazi dominance were now dwarfed by Allied arsenals. Built by ordinary men and women working thousands of miles from the front lines. The tide had turned, but the waves of war were far from gentle. Every victory carried a price in blood, steel, and sacrifice. Cliffhanger. Yet victory's cost was immense. What price did the Allies pay? Behind the roar of assembly lines and the glow of molten steel, war claimed a quieter, relentless toll. The triumph of Allied industry was measured in tanks, planes, and bombers, but the cost was etched in human lives, sweat, and unspoken sorrow. In the United States, the factories that produced thousands of aircraft and vehicles became dangerous battlegrounds of a different kind. Accidents were frequent. Presses crushed limbs, molten metal splashed unexpectedly, and inexperienced workers, many women and teenagers, faced hazards they had never imagined. Exhaustion was constant. Shifts ran 12 hours or more day after day, sometimes 7 days a week. By the war's end, millions of Americans had worked under these conditions, and tens of thousands suffered permanent injuries. The sacrifice was unglamorous, yet vital to the machinery of victory. In Britain, the war's reach penetrated both factory and home. In a Coventry aircraft plant, a young welder named Eleanor Turner hammered fuselage panels for the latest Spitfire bomber. Each plane she helped build carried the promise of survival for pilots over occupied Europe. Yet that promise was bittersweet. When her brother, a tank crewman, was killed during the North African campaign, Eleanor held her hands over the very steel she had welded, imagining the machine that might have saved him had circumstances been different. "We built strength," she later recalled, "but we also built grief." Across the Atlantic, in the Ural factories, Soviet workers endured hunger, frostbite, and relentless pressure. Teenage girls and older men labored side by side, assembling T-34 tanks, while German shells occasionally fell near the factory perimeter. Each tank represented a hope of victory, but also a grim calculation. How many lives would it take to wield it effectively, and how many of the builders would survive the war themselves? At the front, the human toll was staggering. In the skies, more than 80,000 U.S. airmen would never return, their aircraft lost to flak, fighters, or mechanical failure. On the ground, crews operating the hundreds of thousands of Allied tanks and artillery pieces faced relentless counterattacks, ambushes, and harsh terrain. Every unit produced by the factories meant more men in danger, more families mourning, more lives forever altered. Even the industrial planners and engineers felt the moral weight. Each new bomber and tank that rolled off the assembly line was a weapon capable of immense destruction, capable of leveling cities, obliterating infrastructure, and changing the course of lives in a single strike. The workers who built them were proud of their contribution, yet the knowledge of the devastation their labor unleashed lingered quietly, almost invisibly in the factory corridors. The cost was not just measured in casualties, but in human endurance pushed to its limit. Sleep-deprived workers, exhausted soldiers, and civilians enduring air raids shared a common burden. The very production that turned the tide of the war demanded sacrifice at every level. Victory, it seemed, was purchased with the currency of human stamina and sorrow. Yet, even amid exhaustion and grief, the Allies' industrial triumph reshaped not only battlefields, but the very perception of national power. A continent's factories and labor force had become as decisive as generals and soldiers, proving that war was not won by courage alone, but by the sustained will and effort of millions. The war machines were not simply instruments, they were embodiments of human labor. Ingenuity and sacrifice, carrying with them the echoes of every hand that built them, every soul that operated them, every life spent in their shadow. Cliffhanger. But how did this industrial triumph redefine the world? By 1945, The scale of Allied production had become almost unimaginable. Across continents, the combined might of American, British, and Soviet industry had delivered an arsenal the Axis could never hope to match. 300,000 American aircraft filled skies from Europe to the Pacific. 100,000 Soviet tanks thundered across frozen plains, crushing the last vestiges of resistance. Britain's bombers had left no corner of German industrial infrastructure untouched. The sheer numbers were staggering, but even more remarkable was what they represented: the rise of a new global order. Victory had not been won solely by generals or strategic brilliance. It had been forged in the factories, in the hands of men and women who turned steel and sweat into decisive power. The war had demonstrated that industrial capacity could be as lethal as any weapon, and that national survival depended as much on factories and assembly lines as on troops in the field. For the Allied nations, the consequences were profound. The United States emerged not just victorious, but ascendant. Its industrial surge had transformed it into the world's preeminent superpower, capable of projecting force across oceans and sustaining military operations at unprecedented scale. The Soviet Union, scarred by unimaginable losses, had proven the resilience of its industrial and human resources, cementing its status as a rival superpower and ensuring its influence would shape Europe for decades to come. Even Britain, though exhausted, had contributed decisively, demonstrating that innovation, organization, and resolve could amplify even the smallest nation's impact. Veterans and workers alike carried the memory of this achievement with pride. One American airman, reflecting decades later on the squadrons he had flown over Germany, recalled the factory floors where the planes were built. "We didn't just fly machines," he said. "We carried the hope, the labor, and the heart of an entire nation. Every aircraft was a story, every bomber a testament to what we could do together." Across the Urals, Soviet tank crews remembered how their machines, forged under freezing skies and constant threat, had turned the tide at Stalingrad, Kursk, and beyond. Their pride was quiet but profound, rooted in endurance and innovation. The legacy extended beyond victory. Innovations born of necessity, mass production techniques, assembly line refinements, supply chain coordination, would reshape industry worldwide. The war had accelerated technological development by decades, leaving peacetime economies richer, faster, and more interconnected. Beyond factories, the war had forged unity. Men and women, young and old, across nations and classes, working in concert toward a common goal. That unity, both industrial and social, became a blueprint for the reconstruction of the post-war world. Yet even as the Allies celebrated triumph, the lessons of that industrial miracle remained pressing. The power of coordinated labor, the capacity to innovate under pressure, and the ability to mobilize resources on a continental scale, these were not just wartime phenomena. They were enduring truths about human capability, about the impact of vision, planning, and collective effort. The war had ended, cities lay in ruins, and millions mourned lost lives. But the lesson was clear. The industrial surge that had saved nations had also created a new framework for power and progress, a model that would shape geopolitics, economics, and military strategy for decades. And so the question lingers. The machinery of victory had transformed the world, but could its lessons, its vision of unity, resilience, and innovation still guide us today? The war had ended, yet its echo reverberated far beyond the battlefields. The factories that had once roared day and night were silent, but their lessons remained etched into history. The triumph of Allied production, the relentless surge of tanks, planes, and ships, had not only won a war, it had forged a blueprint for human resilience, innovation, and unity under pressure. In the decades that followed, global supply chains, industrial coordination, and technological breakthroughs all traced their lineage to those wartime forges. The assembly lines of Detroit, Coventry, and the Urals had proven that organized effort could achieve what seemed impossible. Nations had learned that no challenge, whether an enemy army, a natural disaster, or an economic crisis, could withstand collective determination and ingenuity, but the true victory was not found in numbers alone. It was in the people who transformed raw materials into machines of freedom. Women in American factories, welding wings while managing households. Teenagers in Soviet workshops, assembling tanks under frostbitten skies. British veterans returning to factory floors to fuel the fight from behind the lines. Each of them, in their sweat and resolve, turned underestimation into action, skepticism into success. Their labor became the silent army that shaped history, a force as decisive as any soldier on the front line. The scale of the achievement was breathtaking. By 1945, the Allies had produced over 300,000 aircraft, more than 100,000 tanks, and countless vehicles, artillery, and ships. Yet behind each figure was a story of endurance, sacrifice, and ingenuity. Each bomber, each Sherman, each T-34 embodied the hope, courage, and determination of millions who refused to yield to despair. Their collective strength was greater than the sum of its parts, a lesson that resonates even today. From the ashes of Europe to the factories of post-war reconstruction, the spirit of those wartime efforts endured. Modern societies continue to draw upon these principles: the capacity to innovate rapidly in times of crisis, the power of cooperation across borders, and the understanding that human ingenuity can meet challenges that once seemed insurmountable. The Allied industrial surge was not just a historical triumph. It was a demonstration of what humanity can achieve when it mobilizes with purpose, creativity, and unity. As we reflect on these lessons, it is impossible not to honor those who made them real. The factory workers, engineers, and laborers who never fired a gun yet shaped the outcome of history. The soldiers who operated their creations in combat, who risked and often gave their lives to turn production into victory. Together, they demonstrated a truth that transcends time. Resilience is forged in action. Courage is multiplied through collaboration. And no obstacle is too great when individuals unite toward a shared goal. And so, the clang of those wartime forges echoes across generations. Their sound is not merely of metal striking metal, it is the rhythm of human determination, of minds and hands working together to overcome what once seemed impossible. The lessons of innovation, sacrifice, and unity remain vital, guiding societies, communities, and individuals alike. No challenge is too great when nations unite. No adversity too insurmountable when people combine vision, courage, and relentless effort. And as long as we remember the hands and hearts that powered the arsenal of democracy, the world carries the proof that collective strength, guided by purpose, can achieve what alone would be unimaginable.